My earrings were made by an amazing 13-year-old local jeweler. I'm going to put her website in the chat. And then I'm excited because I think, Benjamin, we're going to get to hear you read a little bit to start us off. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, everyone. And thanks for showing up. brooklynbeads.org. There it is. I want to just read a little bit from the very last pages of my book to kind of set out some of the themes that I've talked about for the whole book. So this is where it lands, and we can go back and try to talk about why it lands here. The great modern writer, Canetti wrote, is original. He sums up his age. He opposes his age. After Sontag's death, when new phenomena arose that demanded interpretation, people often wondered what she would have made of them and said that they missed her. This was not because her answers had always been right. It was because for almost 50 years, she, more than any other prominent public thinker, had set the terms of the cultural debate in a way that no intellectual had done before or has done since. One could argue with her, whether one agreed or disagreed with her conclusions, whether she herself agreed or disagreed with her conclusions. She had both summed up and opposed her age. The relationship of language to reality was her theme. Neither language nor reality is stable, and in a notoriously turbulent century, no writer reflected their instability as well as Sontag. The meaning of culture changed over her lifetime, and so did the understanding of its relationship to society. These changes amounted to a change in how, in the modern age, a person was to live, including how a woman was to live and how a gay person was to live. And she traced changing attitudes toward how a person was to die. In politics, Sontag's life showed how unstable even the biggest words, socialism, art, democracy, could be. She showed the wild fluctuations, the clashing connotations of the term America. She was there when the Cuban Revolution began. She was there when the Berlin Wall came down. She was in Hanoi under bombardment. She was in Israel for the Yom Kippur War. She was in New York when artists tried to resist the pull and tug of money and celebrity. And she was there when many of them gave in. She witnessed great changes in science and medicine, from the shifting fortunes of Sigmund Freud to the new understandings of drug and alcohol use, to the emergence of a new psychology. To a divided world, she brought a divided self. But if she herself was one with her age, her greatest theme stood apart from it. Aristotle had written that, quote, metaphor consists in giving the thing a name that belongs to something else. And Sontag showed how metaphor formed and then deformed the self, how language could console and how it could destroy, how representation could comfort while also being obscene, why even a great interpreter ought to be against interpretation. And she warned against the mystifications of photographs and portraits, including those of biographers. So there I am at the last word.
Thank you. It was taking me a second to unmute. I'm so glad that you started us off with that. As you know, I'm a huge, huge admirer of this book. I think you do so many tremendous things in this biography, and I'm thrilled to be here talking about it with you today. And it's so wonderful to hear those last few pages because they testify to one of the things that I love most about this biography, which is that you are narrating and interpreting Sontag's life always through the lens of these very knotty, very nuanced conceptual reckoning. So it's organized by idea and theme as much as chronology in this really like rich way. And you get at some of those themes in those last few pages around instability of meaning, metaphor as illumination and obstruction, the relationships between, her politics and her intimacies and her personality and her body, and how all of those things show up in her work in these like riveting ways. And I wanted to actually start with that last line in which you describe and anticipate the ways that Sontag herself was wary of the mystifications of biographers, and really turn that into a question, which is like, what are some of the mystifications? What are some of the Sontag specific mystifications that you were putting pressure on yourself not to succumb to? Or what did you want to do with this biography that might be something other than mystification?
I kind of like mystification. I don't mind it always. I think it's great for a writer or for an artist to have some larger than life legend. I kind of think that helps keep an artist alive in a way. It keeps her still moving around and keeps her on people's minds. But I think what I was really aware of is it's a very Sontagian theme. A book is not a person. It is a book about a person, but it's not her in the same way that a photograph of her is not her. She's a person, it's a photograph, it's a metaphor, it's a representation. On the other hand, a photograph of Sontag, like that is her that's her. It's not actually her, but it's also not her. And I'm aware that, when I create a metaphor that stands for her and her life, that I am necessarily deforming her. What I'm saying about her, it's not what you would say about her. It's not what she would have said about herself. It's not what maybe her ex who didn't like her would say about her. It's not what some fan who was totally in love with her would say about her. You're always aware that just as a photographer takes different pictures. Different photographers take different pictures of the same person, and it's the same person, but you also see the photographer in it. So, that's a very classic Sontagian dilemma, I think.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You're not going to take the same photograph of her that Annie Leibovitz would.
Right, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. And I guess, kind of really related to that, everybody who's obsessed with Sontag has their own particular constellation of reasons for being obsessed with Sontag, whether it's, some combination of projection, antagonism, worship, some complicated braid of all of those things and more. And I know the set of obsessions that bring me to her and bring me back to her over and over again. But I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about, on a crude level, sort of like what took you to the project of writing this biography in the first place, and what made you feel like this is something that I could commit like a good portion of my life to, which I know you did commit years of your life to. But what was the nature of your sort of maybe starting obsession with, like, what was your relationship to Sontag like, and how did that relationship change across the course of spending this kind of time with her? We've talked a little bit about how a biography can start to feel like a marriage in its duration and its intimacy and its phases.
Yeah, and then also that feeling of getting closer and then getting farther and getting closer and farther. It's so weird and it sounds almost sort of pretentious, but I hope you get it. But like, my interest in metaphor is what unites my interest in her with Clarice Lispector, which was the subject of my previous book. And Clarice was a mystic. She was somebody who was trying to burst beyond the bounds of language in order to reach God, basically. This is a very brief summation of that book. But Susan was trying to get past language and metaphor because she she knew that it was getting in the way of actually understanding and seeing. The metaphors of seeing are the main metaphors in Sontag's work. And I thought it was fascinating that you could take a philosophical approach or you could take a kind of religious mystical approach to exactly the same question. And my relationship to Sontag personally, I had written this previous book about a Brazilian, and I live in Europe, as you can probably see by my walls. And, but like, I wanted to kind of come back to America and see how, for me, I'm sure for you, people outside of the United States will always ask me, like, when did I first hear about Susan Sontag? And I'm always like, there's not a first time you hear about Susan Sontag if you grow up in America. Like, she was always there. She was like the Statue of Liberty or something. She was just like, nobody told you about her. She was just always there. And so I was fascinated by seeing these questions refracted through this American life, and also through a really rational philosophical mind, which is what I think attracts a lot of people to Susan. At the same time, you feel that she's kind of insane. And you feel that like she's put this, like when you read her, you feel that like she's trying to organize something. She's trying to understand something. She's trying to get closer to something. And even though she's very unemotional about it, usually in her written performance, she's very cool. you feel the passion there. And it's kind of hard to say you feel it, right? I mean, like, what is it? Why do you feel it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's the kind of, because it's just momentarily distracted by the idea of imagining that Statue of Liberty with like Sontag's face instead. But yeah, I mean, I do think there's something about the coolness of the wrestling makes you feel the force and heat that coolness is somehow trying to temper or arrange, or it's sort of that sense of like what you feel in the text is also suggesting to you all of the kind of writhing and wrestling that's existing in the white space around the text. And I mean, I think one of the things that I was so compelled by in your biography, which is connected to this, is around the idea of transformation and Sontag's obsession with transformation as a kind of way of staying alive intellectually, but also this sort of driving, a sort of force driven by a certain kind of self-loathing in her personal life, that there was always some part of her that she was trying to kind of like bite off her own tail in some way. And there's this incredible quote from one of her friends, I can't remember which one, where you quote the friend as saying like she would move from epiphany to epiphany like a storm-tossed vessel, like looking for a place to dock or something like that, which I think gets that idea of like there is this cool intellect, but the seas are always also kind of storm-tossed. Like she's always in the deep waters and there's often a lot of turbulence, and the same things that made her mind feel so alive were also sources of sometimes deep unmooredness and unhappiness in her personal life. And so there's the coolness is never without other kinds of heat, whether it's like emotional heat or the heat of gossip or but I'm curious, like how you would describe her various forms of transformation across the course of her life, intellectually, emotionally, personally, circumstantially, and also how you tried to construct a biography that could map those transformations or somehow do justice to them.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question, actually, because from the very beginning of her life, I mean, her conscious life, what we have a written record of, which is actually quite young. I mean, she starts writing these journals. There's 100 volumes of journals, and it starts when she's about 12 or 13. She feels that art is the thing that's going to save her. She feels that reading, she's living in this house with this miserable mother. Her father's dead, nobody around her. She lives in this very boring suburban street in Arizona. There's nobody really around her that understands her longings, intellectual or in terms of travel and reading and sex and all these things that she's starting to formulate ideas about. She feels literally that it's something she would die for. That this is something that is so important to herself and to everybody that it's something worth dying for, which sounds a little bit exaggerated. Like when she's a teenager, she and this friend who I actually met, they had the game about how many years of their life they would be willing to, give Igor Stravinsky in exchange for their own lives, literally dropping dead on the spot in order to give Stravinsky 3 or 4 more years. And it sounds like the most nerdy teenager thing ever, but she actually means it. I mean, I just got back from Sarajevo, and I went in the middle of the pandemic. It was actually fascinating, but she really meant it. I mean, she could have gotten killed in Sarajevo, and I think that she had a very, very difficult life. I think this is one of the things that we're talking about, the passion and the pain often behind what she writes. So like when she writes Illness as Metaphor, which is about her experience of having cancer, she doesn't say that she has cancer, but of course this book is really what it becomes, which is a continental divide in the writing about cancer, because you can feel that passion. You can feel that she cares about this enough that it's a question of life and death. It's not just about metaphor or about the language that you use to describe illness. There's a huge amount of pain behind the public Sontag, and I think for me it really was something that, you mentioned like a marriage, and it's true. I'm with her every day for now it's 8 years since I started this book. Here I am still talking about her even though the book is out. And it's hard to protect yourself from the pain. I think that as it is, like when she gets cancer, it's not that I also have cancer, but I am living with somebody with cancer. And I'm thinking about her and I'm writing about it and I'm trying to think my way into what it felt like for her. 42, I'm 44 now. So she was 2 years younger than I am now when she got stage 4 breast cancer just out of the clear blue sky. So, but it's, there's just the thing about her is there's so much happening all the time. That's the other thing. It's such a propulsive life that in order to organize it, I think I did do what you said, which is I try to organize around themes and around philosophical interests. And of course, you have to say on Tuesday she flew to Paris or whatever. But that I try to put that in the frame rather than in the canvas.
Well, and even some of the jarring effect, I think sometimes, or not jarring in a bad way, but just the productive vertigo of realizing that so many of these like great intellectual reckonings were also happening, like, of course, within the texture and material of day-to-day life, that she was like a human being moving through space-time and lived in a body moving through space-time, and somehow maybe because of these mystifications or because of the force of her intellect or because of these ways that she would forcibly sometimes remove her personal from the frame, it's actually quite useful, if destabilizing, to remember that logistics and circumstance and being a body in space were a part of her existence, that she did grow up in Arizona. I kind of love that she spent part of her childhood in Arizona. It seems so weird. You think of her as like
Hollywood.
Athena. Yeah. Like that she's springing from the head of some god, but actually she's on a suburban street. But that doesn't detract from the story. It is the story, because as you say, it's like that feeling of alienation, or feeling like this world can't hold or can't see who I am. And I believe that this other way of being and thinking and making and to be in conversation and communion with these great minds will be what saves me, but I love the ways that actually part of the investment of your biography feels like it's returning some of the personal and some of the, not the humdrum, but the human, to work that sometimes wanted to evict that humanness from what was in
and this is one of the things, like in the last line of the book, when I say including those biographers, one of the things I'm always wondering is, would she have wanted me to do that? She really did work very hard to get that out of there, and to show the face that she wanted to show, both in her writing and in her public life. Am I revealing something that she wouldn't have wanted to reveal? This is also an issue when you come to the actual materials that you work with, because she left all this stuff to the UCLA library. I mean, she sold it all before she died, and then she had an agreement that she would sell it, the rest of it, including her computer, to the library, knowing that somebody like me, and actually not just me, a lot of people use that archive, obviously, would come along and sniff through it and make something of it. So I think there's always this wrestling between wanting to be known as a person and wanting to be known as this figure, as this metaphor. And I like knowing that about people. I mean, I can understand that somebody might not want to know it and just want to stay with the text and this perfect performance. But I like it. For me, it deepens the knowledge of the person. And I don't think performance is fake. I mean, I think I should always say that, like, in a way that a great singer or a great actress, that's not fake. That's a performance. It's actually often more real than reality. But these are the kind of things that go through my mind for years. What's the ethical approach, and what's the thing that serves her legacy? I guess that's what I'm ultimately wanting to do, is get people to talk about her and show up on the Zoom thing and get excited about reading her. And, that would be the ultimate reward.
Buy the earrings on the Zoom thing is your ultimate goal in writing the biography. Yeah, I mean, I think that to me is such a fascinating struggle of, like, would she have wanted these personal things revealed? And maybe you can also talk a little bit about the kind of fraught conversation around her feelings about her journals being published, which feels connected to that like wrestling of wanting to be known or not. I mean, I was thinking as you were saying that like, if in some ways you wrote a biography that completely somehow was able to anticipate and adhere to the desires of its subject, like whether that, it seems, of course, that would be a failure in some way as well. Like I was just hearing the voice of, you know, my fiction professors saying, you know, the biggest way you can go wrong with a story. I had a professor who said, if you obey the desires of your characters and let them get what they want from you as a writer, like you don't put them in the situations that make them feel most uncomfortable. You don't push back against their desires, but you're somehow always satisfying them. Like that flattens the prose and the story so fully. And it seems like in a way, if you had obeyed what you anticipated to be her desires in that regard, you would sort of reproduce the work rather than illuminating it, or you would be giving.
I love that metaphor because I have a puppy who's like 4 months old. And the question every time he does something insane is, do you just give him the food that he wants from the table and then satisfy him and let him go chew it on the floor? Or are you setting yourself for a lifetime of insanity by not training your puppy? And it's really a funny thing. Like you do feel that. I mean, I've written now 2 biographies and you do, maybe it's a little weird, but you know, you definitely feel what they want. And you feel how much they've invested in one side of themselves, you know. So Susan, it changes at some point. You know, at some point it's being very sexual, for example, which she wasn't, according to a lot of people, and according to herself in her journals. Being very political, which she also really wasn't so much. But I think the big one is really, it's funny you mentioned a fiction teacher, because she really wants to be a novelist. She really wants to write fiction. And I actually, you know, I've been on the record defending her fiction. I kind of like it. I understand why people don't like it, but I think it's too easy to dismiss it. I think that, you know, there are essays of hers that are very problematic and there's fiction of hers that's really great. So, you know, a lot of people are always trying to knock her down a peg by dissing her fiction. But she's actually somebody who is, you want her to have that. I think me as her sort of posthumous friend or whatever I am, I'd like to be, you know.
Wouldn't we all?
Yeah, but I mean, she's so present in my life. She's all around me all the time that I do feel friendship for her. But I think that, you know, do you try to make an extra case for her fiction, for example, because you know that it would have satisfied her to be written about seriously as a novelist. And in that case, I think I did. And I think part of it might be to satisfy her a little bit and to give her that recognition as just something that I would do for a friend of mine. But I also think that I didn't do it when it wasn't honest. You know, when I really couldn't, because you know, I mean, I do push back at her quite a lot, as people always did. But that's also part of, I think, respecting that she was somebody who loved debate. Mm-hmm. She loved, you know, she loved being in there. She loved writing a letter to the editor. You know, she really liked that kind of push and pull, which I think she thought was vital to intellectual life.
Mm-hmm. Mm. And even with herself as well. Like one of the details I remember from the biography that I loved is not only that she kept such copious journals, as you were alluding to earlier, but that she would go back and not only reread her journals, but actually argue with herself in the margins of her young journals. I mean, what a beautiful and brilliant thing. And it's kind of it's like a concretization of what we're all doing with our prior selves, or maybe different people to different extents, with this idea that the argument wasn't just with the world or with her peers or with other writers in other books that she might never meet, but it was actually with these prior versions of her own or iterations of her own thought too, that was also a way of kind of staying alive.
Don't you think writers always do that? Whether you acknowledge it or not, you know, you're always basically trying to answer the same few questions. I mean, I think a lot of writers do this. They're always coming back to the same few things, often that emerge from their childhoods or that emerge from their own personal obsessions. I like that. I mean, I think that's how culture and how thought advances is by people who aren't ready to throw it all out. I mean, I think it's a real danger for writers in general. I've certainly felt this. I mean, we've all felt it. I'm sure you have. Like, you read something from 2011 and you just think, oh my God, like, much less, you know, for something that you wrote in college and you're just like, oh my God, like, and you're just so, it's so easy to be horrified by your previous self and not to take yourself seriously. I think that when you know, I think we all feel this as we grow older. You think, oh, like, what do 24-year-olds know about anything? And, or, you know, when you're 24, you think, well, what do 14-year-olds know about anything? And I think that I love that about her, that she's still taking herself seriously, even when she's much younger. And she's actually trying to figure out, like, why was I so interested in this idea or this book, or often this person. I think it's fertile, actually. I think it's useful.
Well, and I was thinking about a version of that when you were talking about your own very intentional choice to give some real analytic real estate to her fiction in the biography. And it seems to me like, you know, it's interesting to hear that part of that might have been coming from a desire to, in a way, create or help sustain or help bolster the kind of legacy that she would have wanted to leave behind. But it also seems like it's in service of, regardless of what you make of the fiction or how much you like it, it's clear that the fiction is wrestling with so many of the same questions and preoccupations as the nonfiction. And so even apart from a kind of evaluative stance on whether the fiction is worth it to talk about, it's certainly serving that project of, like, what was she obsessed by and how was that obsession sort of working across multiple decades of her life? How are those obsessions working across multiple forms, you know? And I think I totally agree that I think the ways that you sometimes bring the personal back into the frame is also a part of that. Like, how were these obsessions playing out in her relationships and her love life and the way that she mentored people, and that, you know, that it's sort of to see all of these threads as part of a continuous fabric, I think is serving.
I think the fabric, that's a great word for it, because when you're writing a biography and you're writing about something that might not have been perceived to be as successful as something else, in this case, you know, some of her novels or stuff, I'm not really interested in giving her a B- on something. You know, I'm actually interested in the fabric of the whole thought of this person, which is a huge and very majestic body of work that is so massive. And actually, you know, the more you get into it and the more you read of the less well-known stuff and the B-sides, the more interesting it all becomes, because it throws light on these other things. And I think that you're not really trying to, you know, say thumbs up or thumbs down. You're trying to just understand the thought process. And I think that that's one of the really interesting things about literary biography, particularly, is that, you know, you are following someone else's thought. You're trying to figure out why they did what they did, why they thought what they thought. And the failures are actually very much part of that.
Yeah, there's a kind of there's a kind of rawness there. I mean, I'm curious when and how. I was thinking that in a way a failure might give that thrilling feeling of access or proximity that certain moments in the archives can give too, where you feel like you've fallen down a little trap door and you're suddenly right there with the person, even if that's a kind of fantasy or a species of delusion. It can be quite powerful. And I'm curious sort of when and how. I mean, we could talk a little bit about, and I also would love to encourage people to throw questions into the chat too, because I'll just sort of take them as they come. And I have a million questions, but I know other people here do too for Ben. But I would love to hear you talk a little bit about your time in her archives, whether you had any of those kind of trapdoor moments of either maybe like drafts that were never published, that were in a sense, this kind of failure is also a sort of access to somebody's thought process, or other kinds of archival moments where you felt that weird kind of uncanny proximity of being right there next to her mind, or, you know, what surprised you, what you found there.
It is a weird intimacy. You know, it's actually, because getting into her computer is weird in a different way, because, again, you know, I have to emphasize, this was consensual. You know, she sold this stuff to the library knowing that people would research it. Even so, it feels weird to get into somebody's email. I mean, it just really is unusual. I mean, I'm used to paper archives. I just read recently that somebody said that probably of the great modern writers, V.S. Naipaul would probably be the last paper archive that's all on, you know, letters and notebooks and all that. This doesn't exist anymore. So, but I think what really, the saddest part of the archive for me was always just the agony of a lot of it, and the worrying about somebody, like my girlfriend didn't call me back, you know, it's June 3rd, 1962. And just seeing this person wasting her time, as we all do, you know, like worrying about money, worrying about career, worrying about love lives. But it also really does bring you close to someone. In the way that along living with someone as a friend and hearing about their problems with their kids, or their problems with, you know, drinking, or their problems with their boyfriend, or, I mean, that it's nice, you know, in some weird way, it gets you closer to the person than, you know, the big moments. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I was thinking, you know, as you were saying, as you were describing that feeling of kind of slight sadness when you would see, you know, the ways that the I don't know, the trivial or the heartbroken or the kind of the obsessing and, you know, June of 1962 or whatever about my girlfriend didn't call me back, how that does create this feeling of sadness. But I was thinking, for me, it's like those are some of the moments that I've always loved most in her journals, maybe also for that self-serving reason that it gave me hope that if I was a person who also felt sad about somebody not texting me back, that didn't mean I was excluded from the ranks of ever having a profound thought, which is not to say that I ever have had a profound thought, just that I didn't immediately foreclose the possibility by virtue of, you know, caring about all of those deeply, deeply human things as well. Like there's something that's so kind of, again, it never detracts from her at all, in the same way that like Marilyn Robinson's journals, when she was writing housekeeping, the fact that they're full of grocery lists and like her toddler's little jammy fingerprints, like nothing detracts there. It's all like, right, this work is emerging from a complicated life that has all of these registers of feeling in it. It's sort of like nothing is lost. It's just like this mind was processing. And, you know, maybe you could tell the story of, and I see we have some questions in the chat too, but the story of the kind of famous closing idea in Against Interpretation, and how that also emerged from this matrix of personal relationships and a sort of sense of insecurity within those relationships. Because that to me is a moment where you see the self who was waiting to get called back and the self who's creating really important thinking. They're the same self, and you sort of understand it better by virtue of between them.
Yeah, I'm always sort of amazed by people. I think there's a real need to project onto people. I mean, you said this at the very beginning about, you know, that Susan was often a projection of people. There's a need that I've felt a lot from different people I've spoken to, or who've written about my book or whatever, who really are kind of disappointed that she was in a lot of ways a normal person. You know, she was an extraordinary person in so many ways, but in a lot of ways, she did worry about money. She worried about her kids, her kid, you know, she worried about paying the rent and you know, why somebody didn't text her back. I mean, all that stuff. And to me, that makes the writing actually more impressive, because most people, everybody has that stuff. Everybody. You do, I do, everybody here does. And actually, it's more impressive to see that something emerges from that life that rises above it in a way, and that reflects it. And I think that when you look at somebody like her, who seems so intimidating. I mean, when you asked about, you know, my relationship with her before I started this book, I was intimidated by her. I mean, wasn't everybody? Like she seemed very unapproachable. And in fact, she is. And so like Marilyn Robinson's like toddler fingerprints, I mean, that's where it comes from. And I think that I don't know, I enjoy seeing that, because for me, I can understand that for some people, it seems to be a diminishment of the person. But for me, it's just impressive. I'm just amazed that they could do it when the like person was, you know, the like car alarm was going off outside their apartment. You know, like that drives me insane. I can't do anything. And like, and
It
there she
looks
is.
like
Oh, but you asked about Against Interpretation, and so Against Interpretation is one of her very famous essays of 1964 that she, the famous line is that, you know, instead of a hermeneutics, we need an erotics of art. So in other words, hermeneutics, which means interpretation, you know, these very complicated things that this is a world, her world intellectually, it's coming out of Marx and Freud, basically. So there's these huge, huge things that explain everything. And they take many, many years to master and to understand, but after you do it, you actually understand everything about the world. I mean, that's the idea. So just to put it very quickly. But she thought, no, maybe instead of that, I mean, that was her natural tendency to like go to the library. But she said, no, maybe you could just like go to a movie and enjoy it, or just like fuck somebody and have a great night, or, you know, or get stoned or something and actually experience art in the same way that you would experience sex, or you would experience something really beautiful, or a smell, without all the encyclopedias around you. And this is why I think Sontag becomes so famous. You know, this is something that I always struggled with, is why was she so famous? Because there wasn't anyone like her before, and there hasn't been anyone like her since then. But I think that because of that, you know, that comes out the year after Notes on Camp, and Notes on Camp, which is about gay aesthetics. Those two things together were part of this movement of liberation in the 60s that becomes, you know, it becomes known as the 60s, when basically three big liberationist movements are happening, which is the Black civil rights movement, the feminist movement, and the gay rights movement. And she manages to be identified with those liberations and become a figure of projection for people again. You know, people sort of want to hang out with Susan Sontag, and even in 1968, she's 35, and Larry McMurtry writes this essay in a Texas newspaper about how you can get really famous. And he said, you know, if you're a Texas writer and you do this and that and the other, maybe if you're successful enough, you might even get to meet Susan Sontag. And, you know, she's 35. And I think, like, how is she already this aspirational figure for some creative writing kid in Texas? But I think it's because she symbolized that new way of looking and being that was this new human that was trying to be born out of that.
Yeah, it's so much amazing what you just said. And I think, you know, and I was so moved in the biography too, to learn that what seems like such a sort of fully formed and almost strident way of thinking and arguing about art in that essay was really born out of a kind of, connected to everything we've been talking about, a kind of resistance to her own natural tendencies to think her way into things. And also, you know, her conversation, I think it was Paul Thek who had said, you know, you can't see like Irene, you just you interpret too much, you know, so that she's, again, not explicitly, but once you understand those moments of insecurity inside relationships, you see the way that she's also is sort of arguing against herself there too. And
oh yeah, I mean, I have that great quote from her girlfriend who I met, who died recently, unfortunately, Harriet. You know, she talks about going to the Prado, and she said, God, you know, she had this long dissertation about every painting. And, you know, that was how she grasped this world that was alien to her as a little girl, you know, growing up in this cultural desert that she calls it. And I think that she realizes really young that she needs to try to get past that. And so she's always kind of fustigating herself in these ways. And she's kind of insisting that she be someone else. I think that, you know, you started at the very beginning about her tendency towards reinvention, her desire to reinvent herself. I think this is a really healthy thing in a certain way. I mean, I think that people who are really happy with themselves, like, often don't do much, because why would you? You're great. Everything's, you know, have another, you know, watch another thing on Netflix. You know, you're perfect. And she didn't feel that way. I think a lot of her energy and dynamism came out of that struggle. But at the same time, you also feel that she paid a very high price for it. But yeah, she wanted to be that spontaneous, sensual person.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people probably were better, like took her advice better than she did.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some really amazing questions in the chat that I'm going to take us to, but I do think you do such a beautiful job in the biography of kind of mapping that what was generative about some of those internal tensions inside of her, rather than sort of knee-jerk pathologizing them or something. And I think there are two questions that I'm going to sort of put together from the chat, because they feel to me at least connected. One is from Stephen Lehman, sorry if I'm saying it wrong. In 2002, Dorothy Gallagher wrote this: "No more than a biography or a novel is memoir true to life, because truly life is just one damn thing after another. The writer's business is to find the shape in unruly life and to serve her story. Not, you may know, to serve her family or to serve the truth, but to serve the story. There really is no choice. A reporter of fact is in service to the facts, a eulogist to the family of the dead, but a writer serves the story without apology to competing claims." In writing the Sontag biography, did you experience a potential conflict between truth and the story? And if so, how did you negotiate those rapids?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like I could talk about that for 3 hours, but basically, yes. I mean, the story and truth aren't necessarily opposed. I mean, I think what we're saying about the portraits and metaphors and photographs, they look different depending on the artist who creates them. But, you know, they are true in the way that they're true. I think that the truth criterion is what often, or the failure to listen to your own story, maybe I should put it that way. The failure to listen to your own opinions and your own story and let other people, especially when you have a figure as controversial and as written about as Sontag, is that it becomes, you know, I think a lot of academic writers do this because they're trained to, I should say we, you know, are trained to. I went to college. You know, you say, well, Leslie Jamison says this. On the other hand, Benjamin Moser says that. Well, if you're reading a book by Stephen Lehman, you don't care what Leslie and Ben said about something. You are reading the book for the person who's writing the book. And so that's one thing. The other thing is that I think she's right. I don't know this quote. I'm just kind of, it's defining the shape in an unruly life. So a life is not a narrative. I mean, if I told you what I did today, which was not a whole lot, versus, or you and I, Leslie, like we recounted this gathering here, the stories would be totally different, even though the facts could all be the same. But they're seen through a different prism, and then certain things are more interesting to other people than to me or to you. So yeah, I mean, you're always trying, I think the ultimate thing is you kind of have to try to be true to yourself, which is harder than it sounds because you're not writing about yourself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I think that the kind of that idea of finding a shape in, or finding a shape within an unruly life, is so connected to what we were talking about earlier around these questions of sort of organizing narrative events around guiding ideas or themes as a way to, you know, sort of structure the unruliness. And there's an interesting question here that's kind of connected to which themes or ideas you chose to structure the biography around, and whether you would do it differently in a different form. Alistair Julian, again, is sorry if I'm saying it wrong. If you were to make a film instead of this book, would you have organized it with the same or similar themes and ideas driving the narrative chronology, or different ones? And I have also heard that it has been optioned to be, so maybe it's not an entirely abstract question, but yeah.
Well, yeah, so that's a question I'm working with now, because that's true. And well, I can give you a more specific example maybe of what I would have done differently. Yes, I mean, I am not a film writer. I'm not a screenwriter. I don't really, I participate in it to the extent that I'm a consultant and I talk about it and I like to read it and I'm, you know, I can edit things and stuff like that. But so I just went to Bosnia, to Sarajevo, and this is this perfect story for a film. You know, I mean, here's this woman, one of the most famous women in the world, going to the worst place in the world, in the middle of a genocide, in the middle of a complete massacre of all these people there. And meanwhile, it's really interesting, her life goes on. So Annie Leibovitz is there and she's having these fights with Annie, and her ex-girlfriend Nicole is in Paris, like sending her these crazy letters. And, you know, she's trying to send letters to people. And in the meantime, the world is basically ending. You know, so you have this external thing that's very visual. And if you ever go to Sarajevo, you can see exactly how the war happened, because it's in a narrow little valley. And you can understand that if you just put a few tanks up a little bit higher, you can fire on everybody in the city. Mm-hmm. And, but doing that, you can also dramatize why. Why do you do this? What is the point of art? Is art just to entertain people? I mean, I have an example in the book about this play she puts on in Cambridge at Harvard. And she's really unsatisfied by it. I mean, it's fine, but the people who come to this play, you know, it's like professors and lawyers and bankers and, you know, the usual people you would find going to a play by Susan Sontag at Harvard. And she feels like art is something worth dying for. So I think you could dramatize this as she goes to Sarajevo to put on a play when she really could be killed. And the actors could be killed and people are starving and people have no anesthesia. And I mean, it's just a horrible hellscape. And I think through that, you know, you can show an idea and a theme dramatically. Mm-hmm. But I mean, a book I'm a respecter of genres in a way. I don't think that, I mean, do you feel this, Leslie? Like, I always feel like book people feel inferior to Hollywood people because they feel like less cool. You know what I mean? They're like, oh, like so-and-so is at the like Chateau Marmont with Cameron Diaz, and I'm sitting in my like 2-bedroom apartment.
I mean, I did feel like writers were less cool, but wherever you're zooming from seems like an argument to the contrary. So,
well, it's not Los Angeles. This is just France and the countryside. But like, yeah, I mean, it's a funny kind of way to. It's a funny way to think about the same subject. And again, you know, it's another metaphor. So a film is a different kind of metaphor from a book or a biography, but it's still I think the same rules apply. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I wonder, I mean, there are a couple questions that, I mean, I have 1,000 questions. I'll just hold you hostage in a private Zoom, even once we have to go and make you stay up all night long. But I want to make sure we get to some of what other people have asked. I mean, so there are a couple questions in here about sort of, after engaging with Sontag, sort of how you feel about certain books that she wrote. So Jim King asks, how do you feel her book on photography is held up? And then there's a question a bit later from Christopher Stewart. You call The Volcano Lover her finest novel. As a defender of Sontag's fiction, sort of returning us to a few beats earlier in the conversation, can you speak more about the novel's finery and how you feel it departs from her as an essayist? So either a force.
So on photography, I still, after all these years, that's the first book I ever read by her. I still think it's her best book. I think that it's the book that I think about the most. Mm. And I think about it every day. I have this friend who told me that I should be on Instagram many years ago. And he said, the thing is, like, you have to take one good picture a day. And I thought, okay, well, how hard can that be? Well, it turns out, as we all know, it's really, really hard. And I think that I couldn't have even, I think I would have just gotten frustrated by it and just stopped doing it after 3 weeks. But I think that the ways that Sontag dramatizes the question of how you look at something and what you look at, you know, like on Instagram, you can just run a filter past everybody. And like, if I don't like this line here, which I actually don't, I don't have to have it. I can just erase it. And, you know, who needs a facelift? You can just go put a filter on Instagram. And so how does that change what you're actually seeing? How does the lens distort? How does the viewer distort? How does the frame distort? So like, if I left out half of this, you know, what would you see? You would see something different. So I like that because it's something that's very much with me. It's kind of a mental exercise. Mm-hmm. The Volcano Lover, you know, The Volcano Lover is kind of an essay. And I think that a lot of novelists who are really good novelists write their novels as essays, actually. You can kind of tell they're not trying to force themselves into another mode. You know, I'm reading a book, again, because I just got back from Bosnia. I'm reading a book by Ivo Andrić, who won the Nobel Prize in 1961, and who is a great novelist from Yugoslavia. And he's basically like a sketch writer. You know, he writes about one person, then he writes about the other person, and then he writes about like the difficulties of travel through 19th century Bosnia. And it's a novel, but it's also, if you said this is an essay and just put it on the web, you would think this is a really interesting essay about 19th century postal service in, Turkish occupied Bosnia. So the Volcano Lover has that kind of drama to it, but I think, we both write nonfiction, quote unquote, which is such a bad word. I just hate it. But like, how much construction goes into that. How much, and how weird real life is. You don't really need to. And I think she puts a lot of that into the Volcano Lover. I don't know. I always loved the Volcano Lover.
I am, it gets back to, what you were saying about, and maybe about the ways in which the shaping of the unruly life really resonated for you as a formulation. I think is deeply connected to both the idea that life already holds all this strangeness and wildness and unruliness and surprise that we could ask for, and that the imperative is not really one of invention so much as figuring out what to do with that wildness rather than needing to make it more wild in a way. There's a question that I just love so much in the chat, and I'm really curious to hear a response to. Maybe you saw it as well. It's also from Alistair, and it's about whether you have dreamed about. I mean, it's making me think about what you were saying about being sort of thinking about yourself as a posthumous friend. But have you dreamed of Sontag, and if so, how did that affect your writing? And can you tell us the dream?
Well, okay. So there's three kind of questions there. Yes is the first part. I have dreamed of her, but it was actually only really recently. It was maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago for the first time. I felt she was talking to me. I don't really remember dreams so well, but I did remember that I was talking to Susan, and it was really weird because she was more of a ghostly presence for me. I mean, she's here on the computer, she's in my books are around me, she's on the phone when I'm talking to somebody about her. But I hadn't felt her that way before, and it was really nice. I think it was connected to getting a dog. I'm not sure about this, but that's how I felt it. I felt close to her in that way that I feel close to my little puppy, because I feel like, I don't know, but that's just a very vague thing. So it didn't affect my writing. I mean, what affects my writing is the relationship that I have with my eyes open to her.
Yeah, that's fascinating for so many reasons. In part, it's the second time that the puppy has entered into this conversation as a sort of both a foil and a parallel for Sontag. Do we give the puppy / Sontag what they want? What is the nature of that intimacy? But also interesting to think somehow. I was going to ask you earlier at what point in writing or thinking about her you began to call her Susan, or whether you had always called her Susan, but at what point in the process various forms of intimacy or subconscious intimacy take hold. Anyway, I think we're near the end. It's been such a pleasure to hear you talk so eloquently about this amazing biography that everybody should buy and read if they haven't already.
Thanks so much. This was so fun. And thanks everybody for coming.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Nice to see some
Thank
faces.
you both, Leslie and Benjamin, and please buy the book. Thanks.
Please.
Thank you all. Thanks, Maris, for hosting too.
Good night, everyone, and good afternoon.